Emma Parker arrived at the upscale seafood restaurant expecting a simple birthday dinner, a nice meal, some conversation, maybe a shared appetizer or two, before everyone split the bill fairly and went home. What she got instead was a masterclass in exactly how far her family was willing to go, and exactly how confident they were that she would quietly pay for all of it. The restaurant, one of the city's finest, had white tablecloths and dim golden lighting and a menu where the seafood towers alone cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Emma had suggested it herself, actually, thinking a nice dinner to celebrate her mother's birthday would be a pleasant, modest gesture. She hadn't anticipated what would happen once her family got their hands on the menu. Her older brother Jason ordered first, loudly, requesting the whole Maine lobster along with a side of king crab legs, just to try both. Her younger sister Ashley followed with a premium seafood tower stacked with oysters, shrimp, and lobster tail, plus a bottle of champagne she insisted was basically a birthday tradition now. Her mother Linda ordered the Wagyu steak paired with a lobster tail on the side, waving off the waiter's suggestion of a smaller portion with an airy, "It's a celebration, we should enjoy ourselves." Her father, Robert, added another bottle of wine to the table without asking anyone. Her brother-in-law ordered a second seafood tower for the table, though Emma noticed he ate most of it himself. Extended relatives who had shown up unannounced, distant cousins and an Aunt Emma hadn't seen in over a year, ordered with the same enthusiastic abandon, several requesting extra portions to take home in to-go containers. Throughout the meal, everyone laughed, told stories, toasted repeatedly to Linda's birthday, and generally behaved as though this dinner cost nothing at all. Emma watched the plates pile up around the table, towers of shellfish, glistening butter dishes, bottle after bottle of wine, and felt a familiar, sinking certainty settle into her stomach. She had seen this pattern before. She simply hadn't expected it to be quite this expensive. When the check finally arrived, the waiter set it discreetly near the center of the table, the way waiters do when they sense a particular kind of tension building. Linda picked it up, glanced at the total, and without a flicker of hesitation, slid it directly across the table toward Emma. "You're paying," Linda said simply, already reaching for her purse, not to retrieve a card, but to check her lipstick in a small mirror. The bill, Emma noted with a strange detached calm, came to just over $4,000. The family around the table barely paused their conversation, apparently assuming this transition was as natural and uneventful as passing the breadbasket. Jason didn't even look up from his phone. Ashley continued chatting with her fiancé about wedding plans. Her father sipped the last of his wine, entirely unbothered. Emma smiled instead of arguing. It wasn't the smile of someone caught off guard. It was the smile of someone who had, in fact, been expecting exactly this and had spent the better part of the previous week quietly preparing for it. To understand how Emma ended up smiling calmly at a $4,000 bill instead of panicking, you have to understand the family she'd grown up in, and the particular role she had occupied within it for as long as she could remember. Emma had always been the responsible one, the daughter who got good grades without needing to be pushed, who built a stable, well-paying career in finance, while her siblings drifted between jobs and half-finished plans, who never seemed to require the same attention, support, or financial rescue that everyone else in her family apparently needed on a near-constant basis. Somewhere along the way, without anyone ever explicitly deciding it, Emma's stability had transformed into an unspoken family resource, something everyone assumed they were entitled to draw from whenever it was convenient. It had started small, years earlier. She'd covered a portion of a family vacation because her parents claimed they were short that particular month. She'd paid 2 months of Jason's rent when he lost a job, an arrangement everyone understood as temporary, that somehow never actually ended with repayment. She'd funded Ashley's birthday celebrations more than once, quietly covering catering costs or venue deposits whenever Ashley's own budget fell short of her ambitions. She'd lent money to cousins, to an uncle once, to her own parents on more than one occasion, money that vanished into vague explanations and was rarely, if ever, mentioned again, let alone repaid. What struck Emma most, looking back, wasn't the money itself, though the totals, when she'd finally sat down and calculated them honestly, had shocked even her. What struck her was the attitude that had grown up around her generosity, The way her family had slowly stopped treating her contributions as gifts and started treating them as obligations, as though her financial stability existed specifically to be redistributed among people who had never once asked whether she minded, or whether she could actually afford it, or whether she might someday want something back. The birthday dinner had been Linda's idea, presented with unusual insistence. "Just a special family dinner," Linda had said over the phone the week before. "Don't worry about anything, sweetheart. We'll figure out the details when we get there." Emma, naively at the time, had assumed figuring out the details meant splitting the bill fairly among everyone at the table, the way any reasonable group of adults might handle a celebratory dinner. She had no idea, in that moment, that her family had a very different plan already quietly forming, one where she wouldn't simply contribute her share, but would be expected to cover the entire extravagant spread without complaint, precisely because everyone assumed she always would. But something in Emma had shifted in the months leading up to that dinner. She had grown tired, not dramatically, not with any single explosive moment, but slowly, steadily, the way exhaustion accumulates after years of the same pattern repeating without acknowledgement or gratitude. She had started paying closer attention to exactly how often she was asked to give, and how rarely anyone in her family paused to ask whether she wanted to. So when Linda mentioned this special family dinner, with just a little too much emphasis on not worrying about anything, Emma quietly made a call of her own. She contacted the restaurant directly, 2 days before the reservation, and spoke privately with the general manager. She explained, calmly and without elaborating on the family dynamics behind her request, that she wanted separate billing for every guest at her table. Each person's order, she specified, needed to be charged individually to that person, with no exceptions, no unauthorized transfers of the total onto a single card, regardless of what anyone at the table might request in the moment. The manager, an experienced professional who had clearly navigated plenty of complicated family dinners before, agreed without hesitation, noting the special billing instruction directly onto the reservation. Emma said nothing about this arrangement to anyone in her family. She simply arrived at dinner, ordered a modest seafood pasta well within a reasonable budget, and watched, with an outwardly pleasant expression, as her relatives ordered their way through nearly every expensive item on the menu, fully convinced that none of it would ultimately come out of their own pockets. When the moment finally arrived, when Linda slid the $4,000 bill across the table and delivered her casual, entitled instruction, Emma simply smiled, picked up the folder, and said, "I'll take care of my portion right now." She waved the waiter over. "Could you bring separate checks for the table, please? I believe the arrangement was already noted with your manager." The waiter, clearly briefed in advance, nodded immediately and disappeared to retrieve individual bills for each guest. The reaction around the table was immediate and dramatic. Linda's expression shifted from casual entitlement to genuine confusion. "What do you mean separate checks? Emma, we discussed this, you're paying." "We didn't actually discuss it," Emma said calmly. "You told me not to worry about anything, and I assumed that meant everyone would cover their own meals, the way adults usually do at a restaurant. I'm covering mine." The restaurant manager arrived at the table personally, calm and professional, confirming quietly but clearly that each guest would indeed be responsible for their own individual order, per the arrangement made in advance. Family members around the table stared at Emma, then at each other, a rising tide of panic beginning to spread as the reality of the situation set in. Jason, who had ordered nearly $300 worth of lobster and crab, patted his pockets with visible discomfort. I wasn't expecting to pay for all this. I only brought like $60. Ashley's face went pale as she calculated her own tab. The champagne and seafood tower, she'd insisted on suddenly feeling considerably less celebratory. "Emma, seriously, you can't just do this in the middle of Mom's birthday dinner. This is embarrassing." "I'm not doing anything except paying for my own meal," Emma said, her voice steady, refusing to be baited into the guilt her family had relied on so effectively for years. "Everyone else ordered what they wanted. I assumed everyone could afford what they ordered." Credit cards began appearing around the table with visible reluctance. Several were declined outright, the manager quietly informing each guest of the failed transaction with practiced discretion, while other diners at nearby tables began glancing over, drawn by the rising tension. Robert's card was declined twice before he finally admitted, red-faced, that he'd need to call the bank. And Aunt Emma barely knew began arguing loudly that she'd only ordered a small appetizer, conveniently forgetting the extra portion she'd requested to take home. Linda, cornered and increasingly desperate, turned the full force of her frustration on Emma. "You're embarrassing this entire family, do you understand that? Everyone is watching us. They're watching because the bill is $4,000, and everyone assumed I'd simply cover it without question," Emma replied, still calm, still entirely unmoved by the scene unfolding around her. "I think it's worth everyone seeing exactly how that assumption actually works when it's tested." What followed was, by Emma's own later account, one of the more illuminating moments of her adult life. As the argument continued, as relatives began turning on one another, Jason accusing Ashley of ordering too extravagantly, Ashley snapping back that at least she hadn't asked Emma to cover 2 months of rent the previous year, Robert insisting weakly that this had simply gotten out of hand and nobody had meant any harm by it. Emma found herself, almost involuntarily, finally saying out loud everything she'd quietly absorbed and never once addressed directly. "I paid for half of the Lake Tahoe trip 3 years ago because everyone said they were short that month," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the chaos. "I covered 2 months of Jason's rent that never got repaid. I paid for Ashley's engagement party catering because the budget ran over. I've lent money to at least 4 people at this table, and I can count on one hand how many times any of it actually came back to me. Every single time, it wasn't treated as a favor. It was treated as something I simply owed, because I happened to be the one who could afford it." The table fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the extended relatives who had shown up mostly to enjoy a free luxury dinner seemed to recalibrate, hearing the full scope of the pattern laid out clearly for the first time, understanding, perhaps for the first time, exactly how consistently Emma had been quietly absorbing costs that had never been fairly hers to carry alone. The restaurant manager, watching the situation unfold, with the patient neutrality of someone who had clearly handled difficult family disputes before, quietly signaled to a member of security staff standing near the entrance, a subtle precaution should the arguments escalate further. Guests who continued resisting payment were informed, politely but firmly, that the restaurant would need resolution before anyone could leave. Either payment in full or a formal payment arrangement processed on the spot. Eventually, one by one, reluctantly, every relative at the table paid for what they had personally ordered, some scrambling to transfer funds between accounts, others borrowing cash from each other in a scene that had grown increasingly humiliating with each passing minute. The family left the restaurant that night, not in the celebratory mood they'd arrived in, but in a tense, fractured silence, the extravagant birthday dinner having collapsed into exactly the kind of public spectacle Linda had accused Emma of creating, though the accusation, Emma noted privately, conveniently ignored who had actually set the entire situation in motion. The aftermath unfolded over the following days with predictable intensity. Linda flooded Emma's phone with a barrage of angry messages, oscillating between wounded disappointment and outright fury, insisting Emma had humiliated the entire family over a simple birthday dinner. Jason called demanding an apology, framing Emma's refusal to cover the bill as a personal betrayal rather than a reasonable boundary. Ashley accused her of ruining a family tradition, conveniently forgetting that the tradition in question had always specifically involved Emma paying while everyone else enjoyed themselves without consequence. Emma refused to apologize. She had spent years absorbing this particular kind of pressure, the accusation that setting any limit on her own generosity somehow constituted cruelty, that saying no to being financially exploited was itself the real transgression, rather than the exploitation that had prompted it. This time, she simply declined to accept that framing. In the weeks that followed, Emma made a series of deliberate, quiet decisions. She blocked several family members whose messages had grown particularly hostile, giving herself space from the immediate emotional pressure campaign. She stopped lending money entirely, declining every subsequent request with the same calm, unwavering consistency she'd shown at the restaurant. When Jason asked for help covering an unexpected expense a month later, she said no, without guilt, without lengthy explanation, simply stating that she wasn't in a position to help. When Ashley hinted at wanting support for an upcoming trip, Emma redirected the conversation entirely, declining to engage with the expectation at all. The consequences within the family rippled outward gradually. Relatives who had relied on Emma's financial generosity for years, suddenly found themselves without that safety net, forced to budget and plan in ways they'd never previously needed to, when Emma's support had always quietly filled whatever gaps appeared. Some relationships faded considerably in the months that followed. Relatives who had apparently valued Emma primarily for what she provided, rather than who she actually was, drifting away once that provision stopped. Others, surprisingly, eventually came around to a more genuine reckoning. A cousin who had witnessed the entire restaurant scene reached out months later with a sincere, unprompted apology, admitting she'd never fully appreciated how much the family had leaned on Emma over the years, without ever properly acknowledging it. Even Robert, quietly and without much fanfare, began treating Emma's boundaries with more respect, occasionally intervening when Linda's demands grew unreasonable in ways he'd never bothered to before. The overall family dynamic shifted permanently, never quite returning to the comfortable, one-sided arrangement that had defined it for so many years. Some of that shift felt like loss, genuine relationships strained or altered by Emma's newly firm boundaries. But much of it, Emma found, felt like relief. The particular relief of finally being able to attend family gatherings without the low, constant hum of anxious calculation about what she might be expected to cover this time. Months later, Emma found herself living with a kind of financial and emotional freedom she hadn't fully experienced since long before that dinner. The money she had once redirected toward other people's rent, vacations, and celebrations now went toward her own goals instead. A long-postponed trip to Portugal she'd always wanted to take, a more aggressive investment strategy for her own retirement, a modest but meaningful donation to a scholarship fund she'd chosen entirely on her own terms. Supporting students pursuing exactly the kind of financial independence Emma had fought so hard to reclaim for herself. She no longer felt the reflexive guilt that had once accompanied every no she offered her family. She had learned, through the particular clarity that only a $4,000 lobster dinner apparently could provide, that generosity freely given was meaningful precisely because it remained as a choice, and that the moment generosity calcified into expectation, it stopped being generosity at all and became something closer to quiet exploitation, dressed up in the comfortable language of family loyalty. She thought back often to that night at the restaurant, to the stunned silence that had followed her calm request for separate checks, to the scramble of declined credit cards and hastily borrowed cash that had followed. It hadn't been the most comfortable evening of her life, but it had been, she came to understand, one of the most important. The night she finally stopped being treated as her family's unlimited financial resource and started, for the first time in longer than she could remember, being treated as an actual person whose generosity was a gift, rather than a guarantee. Family, she had learned, was not entitled to unlimited access to her bank account simply by virtue of shared blood or shared history. Healthy boundaries, she now understood clearly, protected not just her finances, but her actual peace of mind. The quiet, steady confidence that came from no longer bracing herself for the next request, the next assumption, the next bill. Quietly slid across a table with the casual, entitled certainty that she would simply pay it without question. Saying no, she had discovered, wasn't selfish. It had never been selfish. It was simply self-respect, finally given room to exist, after years of being quietly overridden by everyone else's convenience. And the most expensive meal of her entire life, the one that had cost her family nearly $4,000 and a considerable amount of public embarrassment, had ultimately become the moment she stopped being her family's wallet, and finally, permanently, became her own.